Week 2 with South on Sunday.
Hello and welcome to South on Sunday. On this week's programme we're going to talk about flooding, to the people who are affected by flooding and how they've coped, and what do they think the politicians ought to be doing about it. Well, you may be wondering where we are this week. This is Downton near Salisbury, a pretty place with the river running by here, but at times it can be nightmarish for the people who live here. Take a look at this. These pictures were in the run-up to Christmas 2 years ago. Floodwater caused millions of pounds worth of damage as the River Avon burst its banks. The devastation and misery all too apparent. Well, thankfully there's none of that here today, but with weather patterns changing, there is an increasing risk of flooding. Once it was perhaps 1 in 100 years, now it's 1 in 20. And for those affected, it really is heartbreaking.
The water just rose from nowhere, no warning, hardly any warning at all. We were just told to get out of the town. We just literally rushing down. We were shopping and everyone just like an Argos. We were telling them the water was coming in through the walls. And they were going, oh no, it's not the river, it's not the river. And all of a sudden, it was mad, get out and run for it basically.
I came down at lunchtime, looked over the Phoenix Causeway Bridge, and I couldn't believe that the river was already sort of pouring over its banks, and it just continued to get worse from then on.
My granddad, in the morning, he phoned us up saying it was flooded, and then I was going to school, but it told us on the radio that we couldn't go, so it just came so quickly.
It started off being really exciting, I thought, because we'd never experienced anything like that before. But when the realisation started to come in, it was pretty scary.
The main difficulty was that I was at work when it happened, which was at the local railway station. I actually live on the opposite side of the railway, the river, so it took me sort of 24 hours before I could get home.
Well, it made my life different because I'd worked at a job for 11 years and got made redundant because it flooded my office that I worked for, and they just couldn't reopen. So it had quite an impact, and to see all the toys and things outside of people's houses was, quite devastating, really.
It wasn't scary. It was saddening, very saddening to watch it happen, and unbelievable, really. I was amazed. I went back the next day, couldn't get into Lewes because it was all closed up, and I climbed Malling down to look down on the area, and I just couldn't believe what I saw.
So some terrible memories there. Now, our reporters Chris Coneybeer and Emily McGarr are in Lewes today. Let's start with Chris. Chris, where exactly are you?
Well, Bruce, you join me on a vantage point overlooking Lewes. This is the superb view you get from the town's golf course as it happens. Now, 2 years ago, it looked very different down there. The flood that came down the valley and swept through the town was really quite exceptional. Now, they've been working on a flood prevention scheme to stop it happening again. The trouble is, not everyone's happy with it.
It had been the wettest October in almost 100 years. The rainfall had been building dramatically for weeks, and truly exceptional quantities of water eventually came together in the narrow valley where the historic town lies. The effect was devastating. In all, 817 properties were flooded, 600 of them homes, the rest businesses.
The severity of the flood was really quite extraordinary. At its height, the waters came to within just a few inches of the top of this bridge, and everything around was underwater.
Just upstream from the town centre, Peter Atkins was one of the first to find out what was happening.
I was alone in my house when a friend of mine arrived and said they'd heard there were going to be floods and so on. And I said, well, come and have a cup of coffee. And at that moment, water started coming in back door and the front door simultaneously, and he never got his cup of coffee. It rose very, very rapidly, and we tried to rescue what we could, but by the time it was up to our waists and above, we were struggling to take stuff upstairs. We didn't really think of it until it reached sort of something like this, when we realized we were getting really cold and shivery and that we were in danger.
Eventually, the waters reached more than 8 feet up the wall, and they had to be rescued by boat.
I think we found afterwards that it wasn't the loss of the possession so much as the sort of rather traumatic, stressful effect of being sort of taken out of one's house and becoming refugees in a sense.
As the flood receded, a long-term solution was considered. At a cost of something approaching £11 million, the plan is to build new flood walls and banking along the river and to make more effective use of the floodplain downstream of the town. It'll take a decade to complete. And at the end, there'll be 3 levels of risk. One area, including the fire station and an industrial estate, will risk flooding once every 200 years. Another, in the centre, will be at risk once every 100 years. Another will remain as much at risk as it is now, once in every 50 years. And that's where Peter's house is.
They're saying that the cost of the damage in this enclave of 4 houses was 160,000. It wasn't. It's 800,000. So it's vastly more, nearly 5 times as much as the Environment Agency calculations say. It's not their fault. It's government rules about how you calculate the cost of damage, and they need to be changed.
This is one of the points that's now being vigorously contested by the local action group.
The government rules mean that what is invested in flood defence is related to the value of the property that's to be protected. The rules undervalue our property by a factor of about 2.5. So we're starting with our hands tied behind our back.
So are they basically saying that the property isn't worth enough to be worth protecting?
Exactly.
Well, what do you think about that?
We think it's ridiculous.
2 years on, Peter's house has only just been restored. It's been a difficult time.
Very difficult, very stressful. Interestingly, it was stressful after we got back in March. You would have thought that the stress would then cease, but not at all.
The first tentative signs of new flood prevention are now evident. The main scheme, of course, will involve very much more, but that faces stormy opposition from those who say the plan doesn't provide all that Lewes needs to deal with the threat of future flooding.
Well, the organisation responsible for flood prevention here is the Environment Agency, and the Sussex area manager is Peter Midgley, who joins me now. Peter, what exactly are you planning to do?
Within the next decade, what we've got is a rolling programme of increasing the standards of defence dramatically here in the town centre by building up the walls and embankments up to a new, much higher standard. We also want to look at how we can use the floodplain down below Lewes better to actually draw water through the town, again with the effect of reducing the flood risk to the centre.
In a sense, you're going to finish up with a sort of a 3-tier system here. Why is that? Why can't all of it have a risk of 1 in 200 years?
What we are doing is spending the public's money here. We have to look at the benefits of doing the work and the cost of doing the work. By balancing those together, the environmental, the social and the engineering aspects of the work that we can do, we have a complex series of equations which shows us how we should best spend the public money. It's showing us that by looking at the community as a whole, we can afford to really dramatically increase the standard of defence here in the town centre. But in some of the more outlying areas, we're going to maintain the defences as they are now. But it is a big increase for Lewes.
But those people who are going to be more at risk in the future, even after all this work you've done, I mean, they're going to feel slightly cheated, aren't they?
They're not going to be more at risk. They will still be defended to a good standard, indeed the same standard as much of the country. What we're saying is we've only got so much money, we've got so much funding, we should spend the public money wisely. What we're doing is concentrating the priority spend here in the town centre where the risks and consequences of flooding are greater.
What are the chances, Peter, of Lewes having a flood on the scale of the one that it did 2 years ago?
That risk will always be there. The centre of Lewes lies in the floodplain. It will always lie in the floodplain. So whatever we do, there will always be some risk. But what we are going to do is drastically increase the standard of defences here down through the town centre to try and meet the needs of today's town and indeed to allow for global warming in the future.
Well, Peter, thank you very much indeed for that.
Thank you.
Now, the scale of the problem is considerable. When the floods came, they were staggering in their impact. And the job of trying to prevent or reduce the risk of that happening again is enormous. And it will cost a lot too. So where's the money coming from? Well, Councillor Tony Reid from East Sussex County Council, you had this huge thing happen, this huge flood 2 years ago, which most local authorities won't have had to worry about. Do you feel slightly hard done by in a sense?
Yeah, the simple answer is yes. The more honest answer is that East Sussex, to a lot of people's surprise, is the poorest county in the southeast, and one of the poorest in the whole country for a start. We have a high percentage of elderly residents, fixed incomes, often modest incomes. The average salary for people earning salaries in East Sussex is very low. And those factors, combined with the fact that we already pay, in relative terms, a very high council tax, means that people not earning much are paying a lot of tax. To load more on top via the need for flood mitigation, it is unfair.
The three-tier system of the three levels of risk, do you have any thoughts on that at all?
People living in adjacent streets may get a different level of flood defence. Not only is that personally scary, but it has a practical annual worry that it will influence whether or not they can get insurance, what premium they have to pay for that insurance, and issues like that. So I think it is unsatisfactory the way it works in an urban area like this. And I have to say there's one other element to this. The actual risk analysis presumes a certain amount of damage based on the value of the property. It turns out that the government's way of evaluating the property isn't always terribly realistic. It generally understates the value of the property. So therefore the amount you would spend on mitigation is also understated, and that compounds the problem.
OK, well Tony, thank you very much indeed for that. And that's it for the moment from Lewes. Now back to Bruce.
Well, of course, Lewes isn't the only place affected by flooding. Indeed, it's estimated that something like 2 million homes across the United Kingdom are at risk. But staggeringly, most of us don't know what to look out for. The Environment Agency has 4 warning codes. This one stands for Flood Watch. That means flooding is possible and that we should be prepared. That's followed by a flood warning. That means flooding is expected, affecting homes, businesses and the main roads. Act now. This one needs no explanation. Severe flooding expected, imminent danger to life and property. And last but not least, the most welcome sign of all, the all clear. Flood watches and warnings are no longer in force. But even with all that, sometimes the waters just keep rising and there's little to be done about it. And even when things do get better, then there's the aftermath to cope with. Emily McGarr has been counting the cost.
2 years on, and furniture company Restall Brown and Clennell's like it was early on October the 12th, 2000.
Well, earlier in the morning, we was getting reports from the polishing department saying how fast the water was coming up. But I had been involved with a flood in 1960, and I knew our building was 2'6" above that level, and I didn't believe it could be worse than that. But it was. When we realised how quick it was coming up, everyone was working hard to get the furniture on the highest pace as possible to try and save it.
Everybody mucked in, everybody did it and didn't think of your safety really.
It all happened very quickly, and basically we ended up being rescued by inshore lifeboat which came up the road. But the water was this high because I waded out at my chest height out of the building at the end, about half a dozen of us.
This room was the milling department, full of machines in October 2000. It's now a storeroom, the only one yet to be refurbished. Within a couple of hours, you can see how quickly the water rose to this level. It's no surprise that everything was ruined.
Didn't realise like everything was going to be upturned. The water just picked up everything and just tipped upside down, and mud everywhere.
A bit heartbreaking really, because I mean there's lots of stuff absolutely ruined, and it was just a mess, mud on the floor. Everything was just muddy and smelly.
The company had to move to New Haven while the factory was refurbished, almost rebuilt in many areas.
Electrical equipment obviously was damaged, and all the fuse boxes and all the machine connections are all up high to avoid the same thing happening again.
The workers only came back to the Lewes factory 3 months ago after thousands of pounds of refurbishment. Now the company's facing another problem.
The insurance company paid out quite well with the problems that we had, but reinsure is a bit of a problem.
Restall, Brown and Clennell's not alone. The Riverside shopping centre in central Lewes was overcome with water. Now getting insurance is proving difficult.
This year I had a 25% increase in my premium, and whereas I didn't have a specific excess before on flood cover, it's now been imposed at £10,000.
The florist next door can't get insurance at all.
My company said that they couldn't cover me for flood again. They doubled the premiums, but they couldn't actually cover me for it. And then I shopped around to try and find cover elsewhere, and nobody, not even now, will touch us for insurance.
Day-to-day life is back to normal for most of Lewes's businesses, but they watch the weather forecast with interest, knowing that a few days of heavy rain and wet ground could make the river rise again and the place flood again. And this time there might be nobody to pay for the damage repairs.
Next time the polishers come running up and say the waters are rising up and we ought to get out, I think I'll be getting out, yes.
Of course, many more people than we've shown were affected by the floods. They paid for the damage to be cleared up. They're still paying for it through insurance. Joining me is Steve Dawson from the Warren Hill Insurance Company. Steve, how big an incident was this for you?
Well, it's extremely busy for us. We were getting telephone calls constantly with people in a terrible state of panic, with massive problems for them, particularly business people.
What level of claims did you see?
In terms of amounts, I can't really give you amounts, but I think we were getting something like a week's worth of claims in every day.
I mean, in terms of now getting insurance, have people in Lewes seen their premiums rise?
I think it's fair to say that people have seen increases, in some cases up to 30%, and that's largely dependent upon the size of claim that they may have submitted.
So it's mainly people who've been flooded who will see the rises?
I should think so, yes. I think the insurance companies will try to claw back premiums by hitting the people who've actually suffered the most.
For people who've had flood defence work done since 2000, will that be recognised in their insurance premiums?
It certainly should be. It's important that they draw that to the attention of the insurers or the brokers to make sure that the broker has something with which to negotiate for them.
What about people who can't get cover at all? We've heard from somebody who just cannot get insurance. It seems so unfair that if somebody could be uninsurable effectively.
It certainly does, and there is an undertaking by the Association of British Insurers to provide flood cover, certainly up to the end of 2002. We're hoping that that's going to be extended, but I would always say try to approach a broker, because a broker can sometimes negotiate an insurance for you that you couldn't otherwise do yourself.
Thank you, Steve. I'm sure the issue of getting insurance will rumble on for a while yet. Back to you, Bruce.
Thanks, Emily. So, the government is spending more money on flood defences, and the insurance companies are trying to ensure that we have adequate cover. But are you convinced?
The whole issue is still not resolved. The Environment Agency's put forward certain solutions which may or may not be the correct ones. As yet, nothing's been built. It's going to be several years before anything is built, and in the meantime we watch the rain come down, you know.
Well, unless they do something about these flood defences, I think it could occur again. It takes freak tides and freak weather to do it, but you could never forecast that, could you?
Absolutely diabolical. They haven't done anything about it. Well, every time it rains like this in the weather, my in-laws are, panic-stricken. They're an elderly couple, and they had to move everything upstairs. You can't do it, save everything fast enough.
It was such a shock when it happened. No one expected this to happen. But they sort of half expect it might happen again, and I think they would be very be hit really bad, yeah.
So what can we expect in the future? Is it all down to climate change or what? Let's join our weatherman Tom Schlaffenacker. Tom, is it our imagination that these floods are happening more often?
Well, I think when you pose a question like that, you have to bear in mind that nowadays it's certainly much easier to broadcast various violent storms from anywhere around the world compared to what we could do, say, 20, 30, 40 years ago. So at least to the public it may appear as if these storms are happening more often because we're seeing it more in the news. But certainly what computer models are showing is that in the future more freak weather phenomena are more likely to happen than we've seen in the past. But certainly not to say that in the past we never had bad weather.
Of course, one school of thought is that it's all down to climate change.
Well, the climate has always changed in the history of the planet, and it always will do, and that's something that scientists can look back on. They've got various records showing rainfall and wind and temperature in particular, and they can tell from those observations how changeable the climate was in the past. But what's happening now is that the computer models that, say, the Hadley Centre has, they do show a trend for a change in the climate, especially in the next 100 years, and that change is certainly more quicker than it has done in the past.
So it's not really an exact science, is it?
No, it's definitely not an exact science. It will never be exact. Even in 100 years' time, we won't be able to predict the weather or the future climate spot on. That the atmosphere is just too complicated and chaotic. But what we at least can try to do is come up with all sorts of computer models that show trends, show how the climate may change in the future, but we'll never be able to get it spot on. But I think in the future, as we do more research, collect more weather information, more weather data, and do more research into various weather phenomena, especially violent weather phenomena, we will be able to become a little bit more accurate in these predictions, but it never will be spot on.
Thanks, Tom. Now, what do the politicians think about it all? Let's hear from them in turn, starting with the Conservatives.
As you know, Chichester flooded in 1994, and it's taken nearly a decade to get the scheme in place, but it is finally there. And I'm also delighted that when Chichester was under a lot of pressure 2 years ago, and it looked as if the city might flood, the Environment Agency, I went to see the Minister at an emergency meeting one morning, and he immediately released £1 million effectively to save Chichester. And I'm delighted that he did that, and we now have a scheme in place. So that's been a success story. We've also got to do the work to protect the villages to the north of Chichester from the flooding on through the Lavant itself, Singleton, several other villages, the Mardens, all of whom have been very badly affected by flooding in recent years.
Well, what I was disappointed with in Swanage was that we didn't see an immediate response from the authorities actually calling around and seeing the people affected. I popped into some of the businesses in Swanage a couple of days later, and I was the first person who'd actually been in to see them. So what I want to see from all those concerned is a response to the people. Sometimes you can't do anything about flooding. Nature, as I say, does what it has to do. But if they do get that sort of damage, then we need to make sure there's somewhere there and we're responsive and we're listening to their concerns so that we can try and do something about them.
Well, one MP who's no stranger to flooding is the MP for Lewes, Norman Baker. Now, 2 years back, he thanked the government for tea and sympathy, but said, we want more money. So, has that money been forthcoming?
Slowly, it's trickled through. The government has, to be fair, increased the amount of money for flood defences nationally. It's met the target set by the Association of British Insurers before they would re-engage with the insurance industry in flood affected areas. It's not quite right yet because we still have the flawed formula which requires flood defence authorities and county councils and so on, all these different bodies to be involved. And that means that even though the government's identified more money, it's not yet certain Lewes will have its flood defences, simply because the county council may not cough up its share.
Yeah, so what is this archaic formula? Where does that come from?
Well, I think it probably comes from Magna Carta or something equally ancient. It goes back to Victorian times or before, and it requires a whole plethora of bodies to be involved in flood defence work, all of whom have got powers, but none of whom, as far as I can tell, have got duties. And that is a recipe for buck passing and inaction, which is what we've seen over the years and why we got such bad flood defences across the country. Now, the present position is the government said we'll put more money in. They'll pay roughly for 80% of flood defence work in Lewes, but their contribution is contingent upon the 20% being made by local councils. And the county council is saying, well, we're not prepared to meet that amount of money, so therefore Lewes will still not necessarily get its flood defences.
So the argument is over whether local government in the shape of county councils or Westminster pays for flood defence work and all that.
I mean, I think the long-term solution has to be either that the flood defence responsibilities go to the Environment Agency and are funded centrally, and that's a nationalisation, if you like, away from local people, which is detrimental in its own way, or alternatively local government gets the funds it needs to deal with flood defence work. At the moment, local government has some of the responsibility but none of the funds.
Right, and what about a European solution? Is there any money from the European Union?
Well, I looked into that. I actually wrote to the Floods Minister, Elliot Morley, to ask him that very question. I had quite a long letter back, but when I read it carefully, it didn't seem to have answered that point.
Now, what about areas apart from Lewes who had flooding problems? Because I've got a lot across the south of England. Have they fared any better?
Some have fared worse. I mean, I think those of us in Lewes have been very assiduous at pushing Lewis's case. We've made sure that the ministers are aware of Lewes. I've raised debates in the House of Commons myself and constantly barraged him with letters. So Lewes is actually quite a long way up the pecking order. Places like Uckfield are getting very little indeed. And other areas which have been flooded are genuinely feeling very upset that after the wake-up call the Deputy Prime Minister talked about, he's now gone back to sleep again.
So, what about Lewes itself? Is it still coping with the effects of that flooding? Well, it's 2 years ago, isn't it?
Well, Lewes is a very resilient town. It's got a good population. It works well as a community. It's rebuilt itself miraculously in many ways after the floods. People are back in their houses now. It took a long time, but they're back in their houses, and business is doing quite well. The long-term problem, I think, unless we get this sorted out, is that we've got, first of all, some peripheral areas where the insurance cover won't apply, but secondly, businesses themselves are not getting the same insurance cover as householders are, and that means that there's a pressure, I think, on some businesses to relocate, and that's obviously going to be potentially damaging for the economy of the town.
Let's talk about insurance in just a moment, but your own thoughts. I mean, you witnessed this misery, didn't you, that the homeowners faced. I mean, what are they saying now in your constituency?
Well, they're determined to make sure it doesn't happen again. There's some irritation with the government, the Environment Agency, with anybody in authority that it's taking so long for plans to come forward. We are, in my view, 18 months behind where we could be. And there's some irritation that we're not yet there, and indeed if the County Council doesn't play its part, we will another further 12, 8 or 24 months delay before we get those flood defences. So there's irritation about that I think are coming together with the community, as one does in terms of crisis, which has been beneficial for the town. There's a recognition, I think, that some people, District Council in particular, played their part very well in the flood crisis. So it's not all been bad, but people are now itching for action.
We're in the rainy season now. I mean, are there real fears that this can happen again, all over again?
Well, obviously, memories are very recent, and people are very concerned when you see heavy rain coming down, when you look at the river going through the town and see the level high, whether or not flooding will recur. And obviously, if it does recur, there's not very much there to stop it.
And so, this business of insurance, now, have you really made any progress there? Or, again, are your constituents really saying, well, actually, we can't afford any of this?
Well, it's haphazard. We've made some progress. The postcode lottery that we've had for the insurance industry has, by and large, gone. That meant that some people who happen to have a BN7 postcode, or they live on top of the hill, were being denied insurance. That's now been sorted out, I think, by and large. We've got an ABI, the Associated British Insurers Agreement, to take us past the end of this year, which means that any houses which have a 1 in 75 year chance of flooding or less will now be able to get insurance properly through insurance brokers. That leaves some houses in Lewes, on the Lamport estate, and in Malling, still not able to get cover. There's an issue about that which needs to be sorted out. But we are making progress. There are still issues around premium excesses, about capping of how much insurance companies will pay out. So around the edges there are problems for particular people, but the situation is much better than it might have been 6 months ago.
So if not 3 cheers, certainly 2?
1.5.
1.5. Norman Baker, thank you. Well, that's it from Downton near Salisbury. Let's hope the weather this winter is going to be a little bit better than it has been in the recent past. We're back next week at the usual time. Join us if you can. In the meantime, from the team, a very good afternoon.